Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share yet another video about the Sony Xperia 1 Mark II. Many of you have reached out asking whether or not I think this smartphone is capable of replacing a traditional point-and-shoot camera. And the simple answer to that question is yes. In fact, most users out there have already ditched their point-and-shoot camera in favor of their smartphone of choice, whether it comes from Apple, Samsung, or Google. And with that in mind, you have to remember that most of those devices rely heavily on computational photography, which means they are actually doing the processing for you on the fly. Sony, on the other hand, has taken a completely different approach, which is we want to deliver a pro experience. Yes, it has a traditional camera app, but I'm mentioning the pro experience because it is a real-world extension of their digital imaging business. And it even actually offers some advantages that you won't find in their regular cameras. Now you can see I've got an RX100 Mark VI here, as well as an Insta360 1R 1-inch edition. The reason I brought these out is because these are the type of point-and-shoot cameras that I believe this does not basically take out of the picture. So when you think of point-and-shoot cameras, you may not think of devices like this, but to me, the only point-and-shoot cameras worth talking about these days have at least a 1-inch sensor inside their body. Now, of course, the Xperia 1 Mark II doesn't have that, but what it does give you is basically the same look and feel and user experience, whether you love or hate what Sony has done with their menu system, that you have learned to use with something like an RX100 or any of their other CyberShot cameras. So, what is the true differentiation? Well, the reason I'm sharing this video is that I have seen countless comments that essentially say that the RX100 line of camera produces images that are similar or even inferior to what someone's, again, flagship Apple, Samsung, or Google smartphone are capable of. That's really a product of people not knowing how to use a camera. And there's no better way of putting it, and a heavy reliance, again, on computational photography. So bear in mind that if you think that your smartphone is better than a camera like this, you don't know how to use the camera. I'm not insulting you, it's just a matter of fact. So this phone doesn't give you a 1-inch sensor, and I'm hoping Sony in the next generation does cross that bridge, because it's been done before. If we take a trip back to 2014, Panasonic introduced the CM1. It was $1,000, 3 times optical zoom, a 1-inch sensor. Android was in its infancy at that point, but they were willing to take a gamble with a $1,000 handset. It didn't fare well, especially here in the US. There wasn't much support for the bands that it even utilized. And then Panasonic, I think in 2016, rolled it out without the cellular radio, just to see if people would buy a touchscreen Android device with a 1-inch sensor and 3 times optical zoom. And I think that should be picked back up. And hopefully this is the beginning of Sony doing that. Now, there are 3 cameras on the back of this device: 16, 24mm, and 70mm, 3 times optical zoom with the telephoto. The largest sensor here is paired with the 24mm lens. Bear in mind, these are all Zeiss lenses with T-Star coating, and that's part of the equation, in addition to the software and the fact that we have a physical 2-stage shutter button right here, that really do make this feel a lot like a Sony camera, even though it is clearly a Sony phone. 20 frames per second, just like the RX100 top of the line, real-time tracking, eye autofocus for both humans and pets alike, just like the RX100 Mark VII, which is not what I have here. So in fact, from an autofocus standpoint, this can literally outperform the RX100 Mark VI that I have here. But with the 1-inch sensor that's inside of this camera and the 200mm reach, that's where, of course, this is not going to outperform the RX100 Mark VI, because it can't approach the image quality, video quality, or the telephoto reach that this camera is capable of. When we compare it to something like the Insta360 1R 1-inch edition, then they get a lot closer. In fact, I could make the argument that the Sony produces better video and better stills, even though the Insta360 1R has a 1-inch sensor. And that's really a result of Insta360 being pretty much a novice in the 1-inch game, whereas Sony is, well, the biggest DI company in the world right now, and they're anything but novice. So while the Insta360 One R has better stabilization and really is rugged, can take a beating, and can go anywhere, and you won't be as nervous as a $1,200 phone. And remember, this is around $500 US now. It's been out since the beginning of this year, essentially. I would make the argument that this is the better camera and video camera than the Insta360 One R. So if it's a matter of what could be in your pocket as a go anywhere, do everything system, I would prefer this phone. So you may find that interesting, even though there is a 1-inch sensor in here, because application really does matter. Software matters, and I do like Insta360 software for this device, but it's something to bear in mind. Another thing you need to know about this, besides 20 frames per second and the ability to track real-time moving objects, is that this has the ability to record 4K video in 10-bit, which is something that you cannot do with an RX 100 or, of course, an Insta360 One R. In fact, the only Sony camera right now that's current that can capture 4K 10-bit video is the A7S III, which I'll be reviewing soon, hopefully once my review unit gets here, and that launch is right around the corner. So food for thought. And then in addition to that, the display on this phone, the 6.5-inch 4K display, is actually color accurate and is 10-bit, which is also unheard of. So these are all, in my opinion, the foundation, the groundworks, the making of a phone to take camera capability to the next level. And this does do that. I mean, when you're inside, and I've shown this on my other videos, you have your mode dial, you have the ability to essentially do anything you want, whether it's the burst mode and taking it up to 20 frames per second, where you do lose, of course, some of your detail, bracketing, exposure, anything you want. And yeah, there are a lot of pro modes that do that, but none of them look, feel, and act like a Sony camera other than this. And while many smartphone makers have been trying to reinvent the camera on their smartphone, it makes a hell of a lot of sense that the best camera maker out there is making a smartphone targeting exactly that function. Who better suited to put the point-and-shoot camera in its grave than Sony? And I mentioned this in one of my updates because in many ways, smartphones have put point-and-shoot cameras in the grave. And when you think about that sensor, the mid-range one, the 24 millimeter, it is essentially the sensor size the same as what you would have found in digital cameras back in 2013 through 2016. Again, that were sub 1 inch. So that gives you an idea of what you're working with. And at 12 megapixels, even when you pixel peep with this device, things still look pretty damn good, which is impressive. And if you just go out and shoot auto with this or this, there's a possibility that things could look worse, even though you have a 1-inch sensor, especially with the Insta360 One R. Of course, this camera is not water or dust resistant, so that's something to bear in mind. That's one of the reasons I brought the One R 1-inch edition to the table for this discussion, is because, of course, the phone is IP68 rated and is water and dust resistant. So that is something to take into account, and that's why it does fare better than an action camera. But again, an action camera can go anywhere. This can go anywhere you go. Those are very different things, obviously. The Pro mode on the video side, and granted, this only has 3 times optical zoom, so it would fare better against an RX 100 pre the Mark VI, where we were limited to 24 to 70 millimeter range. But even then, you have to bear in mind that that 1-inch sensor and having a real camera do make a difference. And that's what Sony, I feel like, is trying to bridge a gap. This is not all about computational photography like the competing products out there, again, from the big 3, Apple, Samsung, and Google. But it does, for any Sony user, give you basically the same color science, the same menu system, and the same out-of-camera performance that you'd expect from, well, an RX 100 or one of Sony's interchangeable lens cameras. And then again, the fact that it can shoot 4K 10-bit is bonkers. And the fact that you can review it on a display that is color accurate is simply unheard of. And the Cinema Pro mode is where that all happens. And I showed this in previous videos about the camera for good reason, because it creates a project timeline. You control the look and feel of all of your shots. And can this be done with third-party software? Sure. Is the execution anywhere near as good as this? Absolutely not. And that's the beauty of what Sony's done with the Xperia 1 Mark II. It's unmatched. Again, shooting images and video on the fly are not going to be as necessarily eye-pleasing or as vivid as where computational photography, the processing, takes over. But you have the ability to shoot raw stills here and post-process. Most cameras do not offer that. And while many of you out there may say, well, there are cameras with larger sensors, they're not from reputable manufacturers. I'm not knocking those manufacturers, but they are not as mainstream a name as Sony, Samsung, Google, or of course, the Fruit Company. So that's something to be taken into account when considering what this phone represents as a photographic tool, as well as a video tool as well. And that's why Sony marketed this device as not only being essentially an A9 stuffed into a phone, but also being a content creator's dream for video. And I could see using this as an extension. I don't know if it would be B or C or D roll, but the idea that it could even do that is something that I would never think about any other smartphone being able to do for me. For me, all the improvements we've seen with smartphones in their cameras, they've been incremental. They're better than nothing type scenarios. If you don't have anything else, it's good that you have a smartphone that has a camera that is better than, as I just said, nothing. This takes it to another level. And a lot of people look at the images that come out of this camera and they're not impressed, but that's because, again, they're expecting computational processing that Sony has decided to forego in favor of creating a phone that is an extension of their DI business. I hope that makes sense. It makes perfect sense to me, and I think it's obvious why they did that, is because they know a lot of users are looking for that, rather than just software being thrown at everything to try to make images look good. Let's have images actually stand on their own feet. And again, the color science that comes out of this, it's just accurate. People look the way they should. Colors look the way they should. I can't say that about Apple. I mean, it's just the truth. Google, Samsung, they tend to blow things out in order to make them look more vivid. And maybe Apple does the best job, Apple and Google, of the two. But again, they rest on computational photography in a way that Sony doesn't need to do that. They know that. They know anyone who's going to be interested in this phone as a primary or secondary camera, because after all, it does go everywhere with you. That's the beauty of it, right? Any smartphone is that you're not going to leave home without it. And that's why I brought this out, is that this is small enough that you can make the argument you can always fit this somewhere. The RX 100, we call it pocketable, but is it really? Not so much. It's a pretty thick camera. But you have an EVF here. You have ergonomics that don't exist here. The zoom, you have a screen that gives you flexibility that doesn't exist here. The ZV-1 would also be a good comparison. But to me, the 1-inch sensor still thrives. Now, if Sony eventually does, as I mentioned earlier in this video, adopt a 1-inch sensor into one of these phones and give us all of this capability, then I don't see a reason outside of needing telephoto that the RX 100 provides. And of course, ergonomics, which the RX 100 has never been a winner. That's why we have the glue-on grip. And the ZV-1 has a physical grip attached to it, although it's not fantastic either. Then all of a sudden, we have a device that, when I'm going out at night, when the pandemic is over, and when I can actually resume some form of normalcy, go out for dinner, those kind of things, I know that I'm not going to wonder if I need the RX 100 unless I need telephoto. And God knows, when you're going out to dinner or just, seeing friends, you don't need telephoto. In fact, a lot of people argue that the RX 100 line needs to go back to not having the 200 millimeter. I don't agree with that. I mean, I like fast glass, but I like the 200 millimeter reach. And that is still what's really differentiating it from something like this if they do employ a 1-inch sensor. We already know that they've outdone everyone on autofocus, color accuracy. It's there. The writing's on the wall. And again, if you prefer computational photography, there are phones for you to pick from. This is not the phone. So hopefully this video has told you what you need to know about whether or not it can replace a traditional point-and-shoot camera, which I said at the very top, it absolutely can. I mean, most flagship smartphones can, but they can't replace these type of cameras. And that was really the emphasis of this video. So another thing before I wrap it up to be aware of, which I mentioned in my full review, is that when you're trying to zoom between the 16, 24, and 70 millimeter, that's not possible. You can go telephoto and do a 3x optical from 70 millimeter, but you cannot transition through these lenses. I assume that is something Sony will address on the next generation because most flagships can do that. But in regards to just about everything else that I've mentioned when it comes to autofocus, the 12 megapixel stills standing on their own, having the color accuracy, the color science that most Sony users have come to expect and most love, the phone delivers. And then the 4K 10-bit, yeah, it's coming from a small sensor, but you know, it's still kind of crazy. I mean, I don't think there is another smartphone out there that is capable of that video quality and color accuracy. And as I said earlier, this camera isn't even capable of it. Doesn't mean the 4K video out of this won't look better. It will. The 1-inch sensor delivers a different experience than the sensor that's at the 24 millimeter, the largest sensor that's inside there. But again, it's about which is going to be with you. And obviously your smartphone is going to be with you everywhere you go. And that's the beauty of Sony getting this right. And I do feel they have here in the Xperia 1 Mark II. And I'm just excited about the promise of the future of what this camera will have to, or rather this smartphone, you see there, Freudian slip, this smartphone will have to offer us going forward. So Sony, keep up the good work because this is a game changer in spite of what many people might think is missing because of the computational side being not an emphasis at all of the Xperia 1 Mark II. Hope you enjoyed the video. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. And please stay safe. Later.